I was standing in the most exclusive bridal boutique in Manhattan, holding a pair of ivory Jimmy Choos that cost more than most people's rent, when a voice behind me whispered, "Those were supposed to be mine." My name is Melissa, and that single sentence shattered everything I thought I knew about my perfect life. See, I had it all figured out. Corner office at one of the top marketing agencies in the city, a salary that made my college debt feel like a distant bad dream, and a fiancé who looked like he walked straight out of a cologne ad. Ryan was a cardiothoracic surgeon, or so I thought. Tall, charming, the kind of guy who remembered your coffee order and texted you good morning before his shift at the hospital. Our engagement photos had gone semi-viral on Instagram. People I hadn't talked to since high school were sliding into my DMs asking where we met, how he proposed, whether he had any single doctor friends. I felt like I'd won some kind of lottery I didn't even know I'd entered. But standing in that boutique, holding those shoes, listening to that stranger's voice crack as she said those words, I realized I hadn't won anything at all. I'd been played. And the worst part? I wasn't even his first victim. What I discovered in the weeks that followed would make me question not just about Ryan, but about myself. About how a woman who built a career on reading people, on understanding what makes them tick, could miss something so obvious, so calculated, so devastatingly cruel. This is a long story, and honestly, I'm still processing parts of it myself. But I'm going to everything. Every detail, every moment of doubt, every choice I made that led me from that boutique to a courtroom. So, if you want to know how a fairy tale engagement turned into the most public takedown Manhattan society has seen in years, stick around. I promise you, the truth is so much stranger than anything you're imagining right now. I turned around so fast, I almost dropped the shoes. The woman standing behind me looked like she'd been crying for days. Her eyes were puffy and red, mascara smudged at the corners, and she was holding her phone out toward me with a shaking hand. On the screen was a photo that made my stomach drop to the floor. Ryan. My Ryan. Down on one knee in what looked like Central Park, holding open a ring box, smiling up at a woman who wasn't me. The woman who was now standing 3 feet away, looking at me like I'd stolen her entire life. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Natalie," she said, and her voice broke on her own name. "Natalie Morrison. And 6 months ago, that man you're about to marry asked me to be his wife." I felt the boutique assistant's eyes on us. The other customers had stopped browsing and were pretending not to stare. My face was burned. I couldn't think. Couldn't do anything except look at that photo and try to make sense of what I was seeing. There must be some mistake, I heard myself say. Ryan wouldn't what? Lie? Cheat? Natalie laughed, but it was hollow, broken. That's what I thought too. Right up until he sent me a text message saying he'd met someone else and we were done. 3 days after he'd gotten your phone number. How do you know about... Because I hired someone to find out why the man I was supposed to marry suddenly disappeared from my life like I meant nothing. She swiped to another photo. Ryan and me at a charity gala. The event where we'd officially started dating. This was 2 weeks after he proposed to me, Melissa. 2 weeks. She knew my name. Of course she knew. "I don't understand," I whispered. How weak I sounded. "Why would he..." "Because you're successful. Because you have connections. Because your LinkedIn profile says Director of Marketing at one of the biggest agencies in New York, and I was just a pediatric nurse who worked 60-hour weeks and barely had time to check my own social media." Her voice cracked again. "He told me he loved me because I was real and genuine, not like other women. And then he found you and realized you could do a lot more for his career than I ever." Boutique was spinning. I sat down hard on the velvet bench, still clutching those stupid, expensive shoes. "Our first meeting," I said slowly, my brain trying to piece it together. "At the Children's Hospital fundraiser. He said he was there covering a shift, and we just bumped into each other by the champagne table." "He wasn't covering a shift." Natalie's voice was flat now, matter of fact, like she'd already cried all her tears and had nothing left but the truth. "He saw on the event website that you'd be there as a sponsor. He bought a ticket. He planned the whole..." I thought about that. How Ryan had seemed so genuinely interested, so impressed by what I'd accomplished. How he'd asked such thoughtful questions about the campaigns I'd run, the clients connections I had in the industry. He hadn't been falling in love with me. He'd been taking inventory. "I need to show you something else," Natalie said quietly, and swiped to another photo. This one was a screenshot of a text conversation. Ryan's number, I recognized it instantly, sending messages to someone named Marcus. "She's the one?" Marketing director, six-figure salary, knows everyone in media. This is the big score. What about Natalie? Already handled. She was never going to get me anywhere anyway. I couldn't breathe. The boutique assistant appeared with a glass of water, but I couldn't even lift my hand to take it. There's more, Natalie said, and something in her tone made me look up. You're not the first, Melissa. And I wasn't either. She showed me a folder on her phone. Names, photos, women with different faces, but the same story written in their eyes. Jessica from Boston, Vanessa from Chicago. Others whose names I didn't catch because my vision was blurring with tears I refused to let fall. How many? I asked. That I found? 5. But I think there are more. 5 women. 5 lives derailed. 5 hearts broken by the same man I was supposed to marry in 6 weeks. The man who'd held me last night and whispered that I was the love of his life. The man who'd convinced me to add his name to my lease because we're going to be married anyway, and this way feels more real. Oh, the man who'd asked, so casually, so sweetly, if I could introduce him to my CEO because I'd love to discuss potential partnerships between the hospital and your corporate wellness programs. Every moment, every gesture, every word had been a lie. Performance. A long con with the mark. Why are you telling me this? I finally asked Natalie. You could have just let it happen. Let me figure it out on my own. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not anger anymore. Something harder. Something like solidarity. Because I know what he does to women like us, she said. Women who worked hard for everything they have. Women who thought they finally found someone who saw them as more than their job title or their bank account. Makes us feel special, and then he takes everything we've built and uses it for himself. She paused. And because you deserve to know the truth before you sign your name next to his on anything else. I looked down at the Jimmy Choos in my lap. They suddenly felt like the most ridiculous objects in the world. What am I supposed to do? I asked, hated how lost I sounded. Natalie's jaw tightened. That's up to you, but if you want to know more, if you want to know exactly who Ryan Holbrook really is, I have the name of an investor. She handed me a business card. I stared at it, watching my crumble into dust. And somewhere in the back of my mind, shock and the heartbreak and the humiliation, something else started to grow. Something whisper. He's not going to front Ryan. I didn't even cry when I got home and found him in our kitchen, still in his scrubs, making dinner like he was some kind of dream husband. He asked me how the boutique went. I told him the shoes were perfect. He kissed my forehead and said he couldn't wait to see me walk down the aisle in them. I smiled. I went to bed. And the next morning, after he left for what he claimed was an early surgery, I called the number on the card Natalie had given me. The investigator's name was Dennis Shaw, a former NYPD detective who now specialized in what he called personal security assessments. When I met him at a coffee shop in the West Village 3 days later, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He looked at the photos Natalie had sent me, listened to my story, and nodded like he'd heard it 1,000 times before. He told me he'd need 2 weeks and a retainer. I transferred the money that afternoon. Living with Ryan during those 2 weeks was the hardest acting job of my life. Every morning when he kissed me goodbye, every evening when he came home with flowers or takeout from my favorite restaurant, every night when he held me and talked about our future together, I had to pretend I still believed him. Had to pretend my heart wasn't breaking into something harder with every lying word that came out of his mouth, but I did it because I needed to know all of it. Dennis called me exactly 14 days later and told me to come to his office. Alone. The folder he handed me was thick. Too thick. And as I started reading, I realized that what Natalie had shown me was just the surface of something much, much darker. Ryan Holbrook wasn't even his real name. His birth certificate said Ryan James Carmichael. He'd been born in Cleveland, dropped out of community college after 1 semester, and spent his 20s bouncing between sales jobs and minor fraud charges that somehow never stuck. The medical degree he'd shown me from Columbia, photoshopped. The hospital ID badge he wore, bought online. The colleagues he sometimes mentioned, made up. Every single thing about the man I was going to marry was a carefully constructed lie. But it got worse. Dennis had tracked down 4 more women beyond the ones Natalie had found. 9 total. 9 women across 7 years. Each one successful, each one financially stable, each one abandoned the moment Ryan found someone with better connections or a bigger bank account. Jessica from Boston, the one Natalie had mentioned, had been pregnant when Ryan left her. She'd miscarried from the stress 2 weeks later. When I saw her photo in the file, smiling and unaware in what looked like a happy moment before everything fell apart, I had to close the folder and breathe for a full minute before I could. Vanessa from Chicago had invested $200,000 in what Ryan called a private medical practice he was opening. The paperwork was so convincing that her lawyer had signed off on it. The clinic never existed. Ryan had disappeared with the money, and Vanessa had spent the last 3 years trying to rebuild her savings and her credit. There was a woman named Diane in Seattle who'd introduced Ryan to her wealthy father, thinking she was helping her fiancé's career. Ryan had somehow convinced the father to invest in a medical equipment startup. $350,000. Gone. And then there was Claire, sweet, optimistic Claire from Austin, who'd been so in love that she'd put Ryan's name on the deed to her house, the house her grandmother had left her, because he'd convinced her that married couples should share everything equally. He'd taken out a second mortgage without her knowledge, drained the equity, and vanished. She'd lost the house in foreclosure. I stared at Claire's photo for a long time. She looked like someone who believed in the good in people, like someone who'd probably never imagined that the man she loved could be capable of such calculated cruelty. She looked like me. Dennis had more. He'd found the Marcus that Ryan had texted about me. Marcus Chen, another con artist who apparently helped Ryan research his targets. Between the two of them, they'd been running this scheme for years, trading information, sharing techniques, moving from city to city when things got too hot. But here's what made my blood run completely cold. Dennis had found Ryan's personal laptop passwords and managed to access his cloud storage remotely through some technical method I didn't fully understand and didn't ask about. Inside was a folder labeled Projects. Each woman had her own subfolder. Mine was titled MC Final. Final. Like I was the last job, the big score he'd been building toward. Inside my folder were files I never knew existed. Screenshots of my bank statements. Somehow he'd gotten access to my accounts. Copies of emails between me and my CEO. A detailed list of every major client my agency represented, with notes about which ones might be useful. Photos of my apartment before we'd moved in together, with annotations about what was worth money. And then I found the document that made everything click into place. It was titled MC Wedding Plan, and it was exactly what it sounded like. A step-by-step strategy for how Ryan was going to use our marriage to systematically drain my finances and leverage my professional connections. After the wedding, he planned to convince me to invest in a medical consulting firm. He had fake business plans already drafted. Within 6 months, he estimated he could extract at least $400,000 from me directly, plus introductions to at least 3 high-net-worth clients he could target next. The timeline ended with a note. Exit strategy. Month 8 to 10, depending on asset liquidation. He was planning to leave me. He'd always been planning to leave me. The wedding, the future, the children we talked about naming. It was all just the setup for the con. I sat in Dennis's office for 2 hours, reading every file, looking at every photo, absorbing every horrifying detail. When I finally looked up, Dennis was watching me with something like sympathy in his eyes. He told me I had enough evidence to go to the police right now, that Ryan would likely face charges in multiple states, that I could walk away, protect myself, and let the justice system. I thanked him for his work, paid him a bonus for being so thorough, and told him I needed a few days to think about my next move. That was a lie. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I drove home in a fog, my mind racing through possibilities. Ryan was at the apartment. He'd texted earlier saying he had the day off and was planning a romantic dinner for us. When I walked through the door, he was in the kitchen, apron on, smiling at me like I was the luckiest woman in the world to have him. He asked me how my day was. I told him it was fine. He showed me the steaks he'd bought, expensive ones, my favorite cut, and talked about how he couldn't wait until we were married and could do this every night. I watched him perform. Watched him play the role of devoted fiancé. I realized something that made me feel powerful for the first time in 2 weeks. He had no idea I knew. He thought he was still in control, thought his plan was working, thought I was just another mark, another project in his folder, another woman who'd be too ashamed or heartbroken to fight back when he eventually disappeared. But I wasn't going to be another Claire or Jessica or Vanessa. I was going to be the one who ended. The hardest part wasn't pretending I didn't know. The hardest part was pretending I still loved him. Every time Ryan touched me, my skin, every time he called me baby or sweetheart, I had to fight the urge to scream the truth in his face. But I didn't. I smiled. I laughed at his jokes. I let him think everything was perfect because I needed him to get comfortable, needed him to make a mistake. 3 days after my meeting with Dennis, Ryan suggested we have dinner with someone he called an old friend from medical school. The name he gave me was Dr. Trevor Hastings, and he explained that Trevor was now a successful plastic surgeon in Connecticut who might be interested in partnering on some healthcare initiatives with my agency. I acted excited, told Ryan it was a brilliant idea to combine our professional networks. Inside, every alarm bell I had was screaming. There was no medical school, which meant Trevor was either another victim who didn't know he was being used, or he was part of the con. I wore a wire to that dinner. Not a real wire. I'm not a cop, and I didn't know how to get one. But my phone, tucked carefully in my purse with a recording app running, worked just fine. The restaurant Ryan chose was loud enough that he wouldn't hear the slight hum, and dark enough that he wouldn't notice my hand shaking every time I reached for my water glass. Trevor turned out to be real. I'd looked him up, found his practice, confirmed he was actually a plastic surgeon. But within 10 minutes of conversation, I realized something was off about the way he and Ryan interacted. They didn't talk like old friends. They talked like business partners reading from a script. Ryan steered the conversation toward my agency's client list, mentioned that we represented several major pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers. Trevor asked pointed questions about which executives I knew personally, which conferences I attended, whether I had direct access to decision makers. I answered carefully, watching them both. And then Trevor made his mistake. He mentioned a specific medical conference that he claimed he and Ryan had attended together during their residency. Said it was in San Diego, made some joke about how they'd gotten drunk on the beach afterward, and Ryan had almost missed his presentation the next morning. I smiled and nodded, laughed at the story. Asked what year that was. Trevor said 2015. I filed that away and kept eating my overpriced salmon. Later, in the bathroom, I did a quick search on my phone. The conference Trevor mentioned, it had been in Boston in 2015, not San Diego. And it was for established surgeons, not residents. Trevor was lying, which meant Trevor knew Ryan was lying, which meant they were working together. I went back to the table and spent the rest of dinner playing the part of the eager, naive girlfriend who couldn't wait to make professional introductions for her fiancé and his brilliant friend. I even suggested we all have lunch the following week to discuss partnership opportunities in more detail. Ryan squeezed my hand under the table and told me I was amazing. The next morning, while Ryan was supposedly at the hospital, I had Dennis run a background check on Trevor Hastings. The results came back in 6 hours. Trevor was a plastic surgeon. That part was true. But 5 years ago, he'd lost his hospital privileges after multiple complaints about unnecessary procedures and aggressive sales tactics. He'd been sued twice by former patients and settled both times. Now he ran a cash-only cosmetic practice that catered to wealthy clients who didn't ask too many questions. Dennis found something else. Financial records showing regular payments between Trevor and Ryan going back 3 years. They'd worked together before. Trevor would identify wealthy patients with low self-esteem or body image issues, gain their trust, then introduce them to Ryan as a romantic prospect. Ryan would date them, marry them sometimes, and drain their accounts before disappearing. Trevor got a percentage. I was looking at a two-man operation that had been running for years. Here's what made my heart race. In all his careful planning, all his detailed folders and spreadsheets, Ryan had never once mentioned Trevor, which meant he was keeping that partnership secret even in his own records, which meant Trevor was a vulnerability Ryan didn't know I could exploit. I met with Dennis again that afternoon, showed him everything I'd found, asked him what he thought would happen if someone were to, hypothetically, report Trevor's partnership with a known con artist to the medical board. Dennis looked at me for a long moment, then said that kind of information would likely trigger an investigation, and men like Trevor, when faced with losing their medical license and possible criminal charges, had a tendency to cooperate with authorities, to give up their partners in exchange for reduced sentences. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. That evening, Ryan came home with flowers and news that made my blood run cold for a different reason. He'd found us a house, a beautiful 4-bedroom in Westchester with a yard and good schools nearby. He'd already spoken to a realtor, already scheduled a viewing for that weekend, already started talking about how we could get a mortgage together since we were getting married anyway, and it made financial sense. He showed me photos on his phone, talked about which room would be his study, where we could put a nursery someday, how this was the start of our real life together. I looked at those photos and saw exactly what they were, the next stage of the con. Get me to co-sign on a house, drain the equity, disappear before the payments came due. Leave me drowning in debt for a property I couldn't afford alone. The same thing he'd done to Claire. I told Ryan the house was perfect, kissed him, and said I couldn't wait to build our future there. Suggested we should probably talk to a mortgage broker soon to get pre-approved. He looked so happy, so convinced he'd won. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat in our living room with Dennis's folder open in front of me and made a list. Every person Ryan had hurt, every dollar he'd stolen, every lie he'd told. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew it wasn't enough to just turn him into the police. Men like Ryan, they had lawyers. They knew how to talk their way out of things. Some of the women he'd conned hadn't even reported the crimes because they were too ashamed, too heartbroken, too afraid no one would believe them. I needed something bigger, something he couldn't charm or lie his way out of. I needed to destroy him so that he could never do this to anyone else ever again. And I was starting to understand exactly how to do it. The wedding was in 4 weeks. Ryan thought he was counting down to his biggest score. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that I was counting down too. To the day I'd make sure everyone knew exactly who Ryan Holbrook really was. I needed to understand something that had been eating at me since the moment Natalie showed me that first photo. Why did Ryan do this? Not the surface answer. Money, obviously, but the real reason. What kind of person wakes up every day and chooses to systematically destroy people who trust them? Who builds entire fake identities and ruins lives like it's just another job? I needed to know. Because knowing meant I could anticipate his next move. And more than that, I needed to understand what I was. So I did something that probably wasn't smart, but felt necessary. Tracked down Ryan's past. His real past before he became the con artist with 9 victims and a fake medical degree. Dennis had given me the basics. Ryan James Carmichael from Cleveland, community college dropout, minor fraud charges. But I wanted more. I wanted to know who he was, who he is. I started with social media archaeology. Found an old Facebook profile under his real name that he'd abandoned years ago but never fully deleted. The privacy settings were loose. People didn't worry as much about that stuff back in 2010, and I could see posts from his late teens and early 20s. What I found wasn't what I expected. Young Ryan had been in love, really in love. Her name was Catherine, and from the photos and posts, they'd been together since high school. The comments on their pictures were full of friends calling them relationship goals and asking when the wedding would be. Ryan's posts about her were sweet, genuine, nothing like the calculated charm I knew. And then, suddenly, the posts stopped. Summer 2012. No explanation, no goodbye, just a complete absence of Catherine from his life. I dug deeper, found Catherine's profile. She still lived in Cleveland, was married now with 2 kids, worked as an accountant. Her profile was locked down tight, but her wedding announcement from 2014 was public. She'd married someone else, someone successful, someone who, from the photos and his LinkedIn, came from money. I stared at that wedding announcement for a long time, and something clicked into place. Through some careful searching and a few dollars spent on public records databases, I found something else. Catherine's father had died in 2011, leaving her a substantial inheritance. Right around the time she and Ryan were supposed to be planning their future together? I couldn't prove it, but I could guess what happened. Catherine got money, real money, and suddenly Ryan, the community college dropout working retail, wasn't good enough anymore. She'd left him for someone who matched her new tax bracket. It didn't excuse anything, not even close, but it explained something about the pattern I'd seen in Ryan's victims. Successful women, financially independent women, women who'd worked hard for what they had. He wasn't just stealing from them. He was punishing them for being what she'd chosen over him. Every woman he targeted, every heart he broke, every dollar he stole, it was revenge for the girl who'd left him behind when she got her inheritance. I sat with that information for 2 days, turning it over in my mind. Part of me almost felt sorry, almost. But then I'd remember Claire losing her grandmother's house, Jessica's miscarriage, Vanessa's destroyed credit, the calculated cruelty of his MC final folder. Pain doesn't give you permission to cause more, and Ryan had turned his but understanding his motivation gave me something valuable. I knew what not getting caught. He'd been caught before with those minor fraud charges that never stuck. Not going to jail. He clearly thought he was too smart for that. What Ryan feared was being publicly humiliated, being exposed as exactly what Catherine had probably seen him as, not good enough, a failure, someone who couldn't measure up. That's why he created the surgeon persona, why he spent so much effort on the expensive clothes, the fake credentials, the sophisticated vocabulary. He wasn't just conning people for money, he was trying to prove he was worth something, which meant the worst thing I could do to him wasn't just send him to jail, it was to expose him in front of everyone he'd tried to impress. Around this time, something else happened that changed everything. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice asked if I was Melissa Carter, engaged to Ryan Holbrook. My stomach dropped. Another victim, I thought. Someone else he'd destroyed. But I was wrong. The woman introduced herself as Patricia Carmichael, Ryan's mother. She told me she'd seen our engagement announcement online. Ryan had apparently sent it to some family members I'd never met, probably to make the con look more legitimate. She said she needed to talk to me, that it was urgent, that she knew what her son was. We met the next day at a diner in Queens, far enough from Manhattan that I wouldn't risk running into anyone I knew. Patricia was in her 60s, tired-looking, with the kind of sadness in her eyes that comes from years of disappointment. She didn't waste time. She told me Ryan had been lying and manipulating people since he was a teenager. Small stuff at first, stealing money from her purse, forging her signature on checks, using her credit cards without permission. She'd made excuses for him, thought he'd grow out of it, blamed herself for not being a good enough mother after his father left. Then came Catherine. Patricia had loved Catherine, had hoped she'd be good for Ryan, help him straighten out his life. When Catherine left him after getting her inheritance, Ryan had spiraled, became bitter, angry, obsessed with the idea that people with money were cruel and deserved to be taken advantage of. Patricia had lost track of him for years after he left Cleveland. He'd call occasionally, always with a new name, a new story, a new life he'd invented. She'd tried to report him to the police once, but he was her son, and she didn't have proof, and he'd convinced her he'd changed. Then she'd seen our engagement announcement and recognized the pattern. The fake credentials, the wealthy, successful fiancé, the elaborate persona. She looked at me across that diner table with tears in her eyes and said she was sorry, that she'd failed to stop him, that she knew he'd probably hurt a lot of people, and it was partially her fault for not being stronger, for not turning him in years ago when she'd had the chance. I told her it wasn't her fault, that Ryan made his own choices, that he was an adult responsible for his own actions. But then I asked her something I needed to know. Would she be willing to testify against him if it came to that? Would she be willing to tell the truth about who her son really was in front of a courtroom or investigators or whoever needed to hear it? She didn't hesitate. She said yes. Patricia gave me something else, too. Photos of Ryan as a kid and teenager, school records showing the times he'd been suspended for theft or lying, medical records from a psychiatric evaluation his school had required after one particularly bad incident. Nothing that would hold up as criminal evidence on its own, but everything that painted a picture of someone who'd been heading down this path for a very long time. I left that diner with a folder full of Ryan's real history and a phone number for his mother, who'd promised to help me however she could. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the pieces I now had, the evidence Dennis had gathered, the connection to Trevor that I could exploit, Patricia's willingness to testify, and now this. The psychological profile of a man whose entire criminal enterprise was built on the ashes of one failed relationship and a lifetime of resentment. Ryan thought he was running a perfect con, thought he'd planned for everything, but he'd never planned for his victims to fight back, had never imagined that the successful, independent women he targeted might be successful and independent precisely because they knew how to solve problems, how to strategize, how to win. I looked at the calendar on my phone. 3 weeks until the wedding. 3 weeks to set the trap. I texted Natalie. I need your help with something. Free tomorrow? She responded in less than a minute. Whatever you need. And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. Meeting Natalie again felt different this time. When she'd approached me in that boutique, she'd been broken, desperate, still reeling but the woman who sat across from me at a coffee shop and focused, determined, ready for a fight. Showed her Dennis's files, the evidence about Trevor, the conversation with Patricia, explained what I'd learned about Catherine and Ryan's twisted motivation. And then I told her what I was planning to do. She didn't look shocked. She looked hungry. Natalie told me she'd been carrying this rage around for 6 months, feeling powerless, wondering if she'd ever get any kind of justice. She'd thought about going to the police, but what would she report? That her boyfriend had broken up with her and started dating someone else? That wasn't a crime. He'd never taken money from her directly, never forged anything in her name. He'd just broken her heart and moved on, and there was no law against that. But now, with everything I'd uncovered, she could finally do something. I asked her if she'd be willing to reach out to the other women, the ones Dennis had found. Jessica, Vanessa, Claire, Diane, all of them. We needed their stories, their evidence, their willingness to come forward. Natalie pulled out her phone and showed me something that made my breath catch. She'd already started. After our first meeting, she'd tracked down 3 of the other victims herself, had been gathering their stories, documenting everything, building her own case file because she couldn't stand the idea of Ryan doing this to someone else. She'd just been waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity. I realized then that I hadn't just found an ally. I'd found someone who'd been preparing for this almost as long as I had. Over the next week, Natalie and I became a team. She contacted the other women while I worked on the legal angle. 5 of them agreed to participate: Jessica, Vanessa, Claire, Diane, and a woman named Morgan from Philadelphia that even Dennis hadn't found. Each one had evidence. Each one had been too ashamed or heartbroken to report it at the time. Each one wanted Ryan to finally face consequences. But evidence wasn't enough. I needed something that would make this impossible to ignore, something that would guarantee Ryan couldn't just hire a good lawyer and make it all go away with plea deals and settlements. That's when I had the idea that would change everything. My agency had been working on a campaign for a nonprofit that supported fraud victims. Part of my job involved coordinating with white-collar crime units in various states, understanding how these cases were prosecuted, what made them stick. I'd sat in meetings with FBI agents who specialized in financial fraud, listened to them explain what separated the cases that resulted in real prison time from the ones that fell apart. The key was jurisdiction and coordination. One victim in one state? That's local fraud. Maybe prosecuted, maybe not. Multiple victims across multiple states? That's federal. That's the FBI. That's a pattern of criminal enterprise that can't be ignored or pled down. I called Dennis and asked him to do something specific. Map out every state where Ryan had committed fraud. Document the timeline, the amounts, the method. Create a case file that showed interstate criminal activity spanning 7 years. Then I did something that should have terrified me, but instead made me feel more in control than I had in weeks. I contacted the FBI, not the local office, the Financial Crimes Division in New York that I'd met with for my agency's camp. I'd built a relationship with one of the agents, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd given a presentation about romance scams and seemed passionate about protecting victims. I called her and said I had information about an active fraud operation targeting professional women across multiple states. Asked if she'd be willing to meet with me off the record to discuss it. She agreed immediately. Meeting with Agent Chen in a federal building in Lower Manhattan made everything feel terrifyingly real. This wasn't just me planning some dramatic wedding confrontation anymore. This was actual law enforcement, actual criminal charges, actual prison time. I showed her everything. Dennis's files, the victim's statements, the financial records, Trevor's involvement, the fake credentials, the pattern spanning 7 years in 6 states. I even showed her the MC Final folder from Ryan's cloud storage, including his exit strategy and the timeline for how he planned to drain my accounts. Agent Chen looked at me with something like respect and said this was one of the most well-documented fraud cases she'd seen from a civilian. Asked me how I'd managed to gather all this without tipping off the suspect. I told her I got very good at pretending over the past few weeks. She explained what would happen next. The FBI would open an investigation. They'd verify everything I'd provided, contact the other victims, build their own case. But these things took time, months, sometimes years. And in the meantime, Ryan would still be free, still be capable of hurting more people, unless we could catch him in the act. Agent Chen suggested something that made my heart race: rolled operation. If I was willing, if I could handle it, I could help them document Ryan attempting to commit fraud, catch him on recording trying to access my accounts, forge my signature, or otherwise engage in the criminal behavior we knew he was planning. It would be dangerous. It would require me to continue the charade, to let him think everything was going according to his plan right up until the moment we caught him red-handed. But it would also guarantee he couldn't walk away from this, couldn't claim it was all a misunderstanding, couldn't manipulate his way out of federal charges. I said yes. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I didn't fully recognize. During the day, I was still the successful marketing director, still Ryan's adoring fiancé, still planning a wedding that everyone thought was real. But underneath, I was working with federal agents, wearing actual wires this time, documenting every conversation where Ryan pushed me toward financial decisions that would benefit his con. The house in Westchester, I went through the mortgage pre-approval process, let Ryan think we were really going to buy it together. Agent Chen had someone at the bank flagging any attempts Ryan made to access the loan money early or redirect funds. The investment in his fake medical consulting firm, I told Ryan I'd talk to my CEO about it, that the agency might be interested in partnering. Let him draft proposals and business plans that documented his fraudulent intent. Every lie he told, I recorded. Every manipulation, every fake document he showed me, every moment he thought he was getting closer to his big score, the FBI was documenting it all. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Trevor. Remember how I'd thought about reporting him to the medical board? I did better than that. I had Agent Chen's team contact him as part of their investigation, told him they had evidence of his partnership with Ryan, of his involvement in multiple fraud cases, of the kickbacks he'd been receiving, told him he was looking at losing his medical license and facing federal conspiracy charges, unless he cooperated. Trevor folded in less than 24 hours. He gave them everything. Years of communications with Ryan, details about other cons I hadn't even known about, names of other potential accomplices, the complete operational structure of their little criminal enterprise. And he agreed to wear a wire himself, to have one final meeting with Ryan where he'd get him to talk about the plan for me, about the exit strategy, about all the previous victims. That meeting happened 6 days before the wedding. I wasn't there, but Agent Chen played me the recording afterward. Hearing Ryan describe me as a perfect mark with a sweet savings account and useful connections made me want to vomit. Hearing him laugh about how I'd introduced him to my CEO, handed him the keys to the kingdom, made my hands shake with rage. But hearing him lay out exactly how he planned to disappear with my money, how he'd done it 8 times before and never gotten caught, how he was thinking of retiring after this one because the score was big, that made me smile. Because every word was being recorded by the FBI. Every admission, every detail, every piece of evidence we needed to make sure he spent years in federal prison. Agent Chen told me we had enough. We could arrest him now, skip the wedding, proceed with prosecution. But I asked her for something else. One more week, one more chance to do this my way. Because Ryan had humiliated 9 women, had made them feel stupid and naive and ashamed for trusting him, had stolen not just their money, but their confidence, their ability to trust, their belief that they were good judges of, and I wanted him to feel exactly what he'd made them feel. I wanted him to stand in front of everyone he'd tried to impress, in his expensive suit with his fake credentials, and have the whole world watch him fall apart. Agent Chen looked at me for a long moment, then said she'd need to get approval from her supervisor. But she understood why I was asking, and she'd see what she could do. 2 days later, she called me back. The FBI had agreed to wait. They'd have agents at the wedding ready to arrest Ryan the moment I gave the signal. All I had to do was get through 4 more days of pretending, 4 more days of letting him think he'd won, and then I'd make sure he never hurt anyone again. The final 4 days before the wedding were the longest of my life. Ryan was in high spirits, more affectionate than he'd been in weeks. He kept talking about our future, about the house we'd buy, about the life we'd build together. Every word felt like nails on a chalkboard, but I smiled through it all, kissed him goodnight, told him I couldn't wait to be his wife. I was playing the role of my life, couldn't afford a single mistake. But something happened 3 days before the wedding that almost derailed everything. I came home from work to find Ryan sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop open, staring at the screen with an expression I'd never seen before. Not his charming smile, not his fake concern. This was something else, something that looked almost like... He closed the laptop the second I walked in, too quickly, and asked me how my day was with a brightness that felt forced. I knew immediately that something was wrong. That night, after he fell asleep, I did something I'd been avoiding because it felt too risky. I accessed his laptop. He kept it password protected, but I'd watched him type it in enough times to memorize the pattern. My hands were shaking so hard, I almost mistyped it twice. What I found made my blood run cold. Ryan had received an email from someone using an anonymous account. No name, no identifying information. Just a message that said, "I know who you really are. Ryan Carmichael. And I know what you're planning. You have 48 hours to call off the wedding and disappear, or I go to the police with everything. Someone else knew. Someone else had figured it out, and they were threatening to ruin my plan. I read that email 3 times, trying to understand who could have sent it. One of the other victims? Someone from Ryan's past? A random person who'd somehow connected the dots? But what terrified me most was Ryan's response. He hadn't replied to the email, but he'd opened a separate document, a contingency plan, instructions for how to disappear quickly if things went wrong, fake IDs he had stashed in a storage unit, bank accounts under different names, a contact in Canada who could help him cross the border. Ryan was preparing to run. If he got spooked before the wedding, if he decided the risk was too high, he'd vanish. And all the evidence, all the FBI's preparation, all the justice we'd been building toward, it would be worthless. He'd be gone, impossible to track, free to start over somewhere else and do this to someone else. I couldn't let that happen. I thought about calling Agent Chen, but it was 2 a.m. and I needed to think. So I sat on our couch in the dark, staring at that anonymous email, trying to figure out And then I realized something. The email's threat was to expose Ryan to the police, but it didn't say anything about exposing him at the wedding. Didn't mention the FBI investigation that was already underway, didn't seem to know about Agent Chen or The Wire or the evidence we'd already gathered, which meant whoever sent it was working alone. And they'd given Ryan 48 hours to disappear, which would end the day before the wedding. If I could keep Ryan calm, keep him convinced that the threat wasn't real or wasn't serious, he might stay. Might decide to go through with his plan because he'd invested too much to walk away over some anonymous email that could be nothing. I needed to make him feel safe. Needed to make him believe everything was under control. The next morning, I did something risky. I initiated a conversation about pre-wedding jitters, told Ryan I'd been having weird anxiety dreams, feeling paranoid that something would go wrong. Asked him if he ever felt like our life together was too good to be true, like someone might try to ruin it. I watched his face carefully, saw the flicker of tension, the way his jaw tightened slightly. He told me it was normal to feel nervous before a big commitment, that nothing was going to ruin our wedding, that everything would be. Then I said something I'd rehearsed in my head a dozen times. I mentioned that I'd heard from a few people that it wasn't uncommon for exes to try to cause problems before weddings, send anonymous messages, make threats, try to create doubt. I saw something shift in his expression. Relief, maybe, like I'd just given him a way to rationalize that email. He asked me if I'd received any weird messages. I said no, but a friend from work had dealt with something similar before her wedding. An ex who'd tried to make trouble, but ultimately it was just empty threats from someone who was bitter. Ryan relaxed visibly, told me people could be crazy and jealous, that we shouldn't let anyone from our pasts ruin our future. I agreed, kissed him, told him I loved him, and nothing was going to stop us from having the perfect wedding. That night, Ryan deleted his contingency plan document. I watched him do it, saw him empty the trash folder, saw him close his laptop with the satisfied expression of someone who decided the threat wasn't real. He was staying. The wedding was still on. But I still needed to know who'd sent that email. So I did something I probably shouldn't have. I contacted every single person who knew about my plan. Natalie, Dennis, Agent Chen, Patricia, the other victims. Asked if any of them had reached out to Ryan or knew someone who might have. Everyone said no, which left one possibility that I didn't want to consider. Trevor. Trevor had folded easily when the FBI approached him. Had given up everything, agreed to wear a wire, handed over years of evidence. But what if that was because he was scared? If he decided that the best way to protect himself was to make sure Ryan disappeared before he could be arrested? If Ryan ran, no case. No trial where Trevor might be called to testify. No public exposure of his involvement in the cons. He could claim he'd been fooled too. Just another victim, and walk away from the whole thing. I called Agent Chen and explained my theory. She said she'd look into it, put surveillance on Trevor, make sure he wasn't planning anything that would interfere with the operation. Damage was already. Someone, Trevor or someone else, had tried to scare Ryan away. And even though I'd managed to calm him down, there was a new tension in the air. A sense that we were all walking on a knife's edge and one wrong move could shatter everything. 2 days before the wedding, Agent Chen called me with news. They'd traced the anonymous email. It had come from a library computer in New Jersey. The person who'd sent it had been caught on security camera. It was Catherine, Ryan's ex-girlfriend, the one who'd gotten the inheritance and left him. the one who'd indirectly started him on this path of revenge against successful women. Apparently, she'd seen our engagement announcement too, had recognized Ryan despite the fake name and the fake credentials. And she'd panicked, thinking she had some responsibility to warn me or stop him, or Agent Chen wasn't entirely clear on her motivation. Catherine had been questioned by local police. She'd admitted to sending the email, said she'd been trying to protect me, thought she was doing the right thing. She hadn't known about the FBI investigation, hadn't known about the plan to catch Ryan at the wedding. She'd just acted on impulse, thinking she could scare him away from hurting someone else. Agent Chen asked me if I wanted to press charges against Catherine for interfering with a federal investigation. I said no, because I understood something that I don't think Agent Chen did. Catherine was another victim. Maybe not in the same way the rest of us were, but she'd been the first person Ryan had manipulated and lied to. She'd spent years not knowing that leaving him had created a monster. And now she was trying, however clumsily, to stop him from destroying someone else's life. I couldn't punish her for that. But I did ask Agent Chen to make sure Catherine knew to stay away from the wedding. The last thing I needed was more surprises. The night before my wedding, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Ryan. We'd been staying in separate places for the final night per tradition, but he'd insisted on one last evening together, and watched him sleep peacefully. Watched the man who'd planned to destroy my life, who'd destroyed 8 other lives before mine, who'd spent years perfecting the art of manipulation and theft and cruelty. He looked so normal, so harmless. And that was the scariest part, because monsters don't look like monsters. They look like charming fiancés and devoted partners and successful professionals. They look like people you could love, people you could trust, people who could break you and never lose a single night of sleep over it. Thought about all the women who'd been here, all the ones who'd believed Ryan's lies, who'd introduced him to their families, who'd planned futures that he'd already scheduled an expiration date for. All the ones who'd woken up one day to find him gone and their lives in ruins. And I thought about all the women who might come after me if I didn't stop him now. Tomorrow, in front of 200 guests and a team of FBI agents, I was going to do what none of them had been able to do. I was going to make sure Ryan Carmichael never hurt anyone again. The morning of my wedding, I woke up feeling strangely calm. Maybe it was because I'd spent so many weeks planning this moment that now that it was here, there was nothing left to do but execute. Maybe it was because I knew the FBI was already in position, agents scattered throughout the venue disguised as guests and staff. Or maybe it was because after weeks of pretending, I could finally stop lying. My bridesmaids, women from work who had no idea what was about to happen, helped me into my dress. A beautiful ivory gown that had cost a small fortune and that I'd never wear again after today. They kept saying how lucky I was, how perfect Ryan was, how this was going to be the best day of my life. I smiled and agreed with everything they said. Natalie texted me at 10 in the morning. "We're all here, ready when you are." She meant the other victims, Jessica, Vanessa, Claire, Diane, Morgan. They'd all flown in, all agreed to be present for this. Not as guests, Ryan would have recognized some of them, but nearby in a private room at the venue where they could watch via the security feed Agent Chen had set up. They deserved to see this, deserved to watch him finally face consequences. Patricia, Ryan's mother, had also come. She was sitting in the back of the chapel, dressed simply, looking like her heart was breaking. She'd told me yesterday that part of her still hoped I was wrong about her son, that maybe this time he'd really, but she knew better. And she'd promised she'd stay, no matter how hard it was to watch. The venue was stunning. A historic mansion in Westchester with gardens and a ballroom, and exactly the kind of elegant setting that Ryan had insisted on because it fit the image he wanted to project. The guest list was full of people from my agency, Ryan's fake medical connections, society people who'd been impressed by our engagement announcement. There were even a few journalists from local lifestyle magazines who'd wanted to cover the wedding of one of Manhattan's most prominent young marketing executives. Ryan had been thrilled about that, had talked about how the publicity would be good for both our careers. He had no idea how right he was. Agent Chen found me in the bridal suite an hour before the ceremony. She was dressed as a wedding coordinator, complete with a clipboard and a headset, blending perfectly with the actual venue staff. She told me everything was ready. The sound system was set up so that when I gave the signal, we could display anything I wanted on the large screens that were supposed to show our wedding video. The agents were in position. Trevor had been secured in a separate location. They'd picked him up that morning to make sure he didn't try to warn Ryan or interfere. All I had to do was walk down that aisle and say the word. She asked me one more time if I was sure about this, reminded me that we could arrest Ryan right now, before the ceremony, keep this private, that I didn't have to put myself through the performance of a wedding ceremony just to expose him publicly. I told her I was sure, because this wasn't just about arresting Ryan. It was about making sure everyone knew what he was, making sure his name would be forever associated with not the lie, making sure that when people searched for Ryan Holbrook or Ryan Carmichael online, they'd find this story, this exposure, this ending, so that he could never charm another woman, create another fake identity, destroy another life. The ceremony to start at 2. At 1:45, I walked down the hallway toward the chapel entrance and saw Ryan waiting near the altar. He looked perfect in his tuxedo, exactly like the successful surgeon he'd pretended to be. He was smiling, greeting guests, playing his part flawlessly. For a moment, I felt something almost like sadness. Because somewhere underneath all the lies and manipulation, there might have been a person someone who could have used his intelligence and charm for something good instead of this. But then I remembered Claire's grandmother's house in foreclosure, Jessica's miscarriage, Vanessa's ruined credit, 8 women's broken hearts and stolen dreams. The sadness evaporated. The music started. My bridesmaids began their walk down the aisle. And then it was my turn. I walked slowly, holding a bouquet that cost more than some people's monthly rent, toward a man who'd planned to rob me blind and disappear within the year. Every step felt surreal, like I was watching myself in a movie. Ryan was watching me with tears in his eyes, real tears, or a perfect performance. I honestly couldn't tell any matter. When I reached the altar, he took my hand, whispered that he was the luckiest man alive. The officiant began the ceremony, started talking about love and commitment and building a life together. The words felt hollow, almost obscene given what was about to happen. We got through the readings, through the part where the officiant talked about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of trust and honesty. I almost laughed at that, but I kept my expression serene. Then came the vows. Ryan went first, delivering a beautiful speech about how I'd changed his life, how he couldn't imagine a future without me, how he promised to honor and cherish me forever. Every word was a lie. Every promise was something. When it was my turn, a breath. Looked at Ryan's face, still smiling, still Ryan, I said, and my voice was steady, carrying across the silent chapel. Before I say my vows, I want to tell everyone here a story about trust and betrayal and the lies people tell when they want something badly enough. I saw his smile falter slightly, saw color across his face. I want to tell them about a man, James Carmichael, who never went to medical school, who isn't actually a surgeon, who spent the last 7 years systematically targeting and defrauding successful women across 6 states. The chapel erupted in whispers. Ryan's face went white. He tried to grab my arm, but I stepped back. I want to tell them about Jessica, Morgan, Natalie. 6 women whose lives you destroyed but loved you and watched you disappear with their money and their Agent Chen gave a signal. The screens behind us lit up with images Ryan's real birth, his criminal record, screenshots of his projects, photos of him with each of his previous victims, bank records showing the money he'd stolen, the fake medical degree, everything. I want to tell them, I continued, my voice getting stronger, about how you researched me, stalked me, engineered our first meeting, and spent months making me fall in love with a person who doesn't exist. About how you plan to marry me, drain my accounts, steal from my company, and disappear before our first anniversary. Ryan tried to speak, but no words came out. He was staring at the screens, at the evidence, at the FBI agents who were now moving through the crowd toward us. And most of all, I said, looking directly into his eyes, I want to tell them how it feels to be one of your victims, to realize that every calculated touch was manipulation. Every word of love was just part of the... I stepped close enough that only he could hear my next word. Feels like because you made one critical mistake. You assumed I'd be like all the others, too heartbroken, too broken to fight back. But I'm not them. And this time, I turned to Agent Chen and nodded. Ryan James Carmichael, she said, pulling out her badge and moving toward him. You're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and interstate financial crimes. The chapel was in chaos. Guests were standing, talking, some trying to leave, others pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The journalists I'd invited were frantically taking notes, their cameras flashing. Ryan looked at me one more time as Agent Chen handcuffed him. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw his real face. No charm, no smile, no performance, just anger and disbelief and the dawning realization that his entire operation had collapsed. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I thought about Natalie in the boutique, about Dennis's investigation, about Patricia's phone call, about all the small pieces that had come together to reveal that "Your last victim warned me," I said simply, and I chose to instead of. As they led him away, I turned to face the stunned crowd. Found Patricia in the back, tears streaming down her face, and gave her a small nod. Found Natalie on the security monitor in the back room, watching with the other women, and saw them all embracing, crying, finally seeing justice happen. My CEO was in the third row, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. My bridesmaids looked shell-shocked. The society reporters were already typing on their phones, and I knew this story would be everywhere by tomorrow morning. I picked up the microphone that had been set up for our toasts. "I'm sorry you all came out here for a wedding that isn't going to happen," I said, and my voice only shook a little. "But I hope you understand why I had to do this publicly. Ryan Carmichael has destroyed too many lives in private. He's operated in shadows and silence, counting on his victims being too ashamed to speak up. I'm not ashamed, and I wanted to make sure that everyone knows exactly who he is and what he's done." I paused, looking around at all these people who thought they were coming to celebrate a love story. If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that we need to talk more openly about these kinds of crimes, about romance scams and financial fraud and the predators who target successful, independent people because they think we're too proud to admit we've been fooled. We're not too proud. We're just human. And being human means sometimes we trust the wrong people. I saw some heads nodding, saw some people wiping their eyes. "The FBI has asked me to let you know that if anyone here has information about Ryan Carmichael's activities, or if you suspect you might have been targeted by him or someone like him, please speak to the agents. Your information could help close cases and protect other potential victims." I set down the microphone and walked down the aisle, still in my wedding dress, past rows of stunned guests. When I reached the entrance to the chapel, I turned back one more time. Ryan was gone, already on his way to federal custody. The screens were still showing his crimes, his lies, his real identity, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Free. 3 months later, Ryan James Carmichael was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The trial was swift. With the amount of evidence we had, the recordings, the financial documents, Trevor's testimony, statements from 9 victims across 6 states, his lawyer advised him to take a plea deal. He tried to negotiate for less time, tried to claim he had a gambling addiction that made him do it, tried every excuse in the book. The judge wasn't interested in excuses. 8 years, plus restitution to all his victims, though we all knew we'd probably never see most of that money, plus a permanent record that would follow him for the rest of his life. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough to undo the damage he'd caused. But it was something. The story made national news. Not just the wedding exposure, though that video went viral within hours, watched by millions of people who couldn't believe what they were seeing. But the bigger picture. The pattern of fraud. The 9 victims. The years of calculated manipulation. I became the face of it, whether I wanted to or not. The woman who'd turned her wedding into a sting operation. The victim who'd fought back. Some people called me brave, others called me vindictive, said I'd humiliated Ryan unnecessarily, that I should have just gone to the police quietly. A few even suggested I'd somehow asked for it by being too successful, too independent, too threatening to men's egos. I stopped reading the comments after the first week. But something unexpected happened. Women started reaching out to me. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Women who'd been through similar situations, who'd been conned or manipulated or emotionally abused by partners who'd targeted them specifically because they were successful. Women who'd been too ashamed to report it, who'd blamed themselves, who'd thought they were the only ones. They told me that seeing my story gave them courage, made them realize they weren't alone, made them understand that being smart and successful doesn't make you immune to manipulation. It sometimes just makes you a more appealing target. That's when I realized I could do something more than just take down one con artist. Natalie and I started a foundation. We called it Trust Rebuilt, and its mission was simple: support victims of romance fraud, provide resources for recognizing and reporting these crimes, and advocate for better laws to prosecute predators who target people through intimate relationships. Jessica joined us. So did Vanessa and Claire. Even Patricia, Ryan's mother, offered to help. She wanted to speak to parents about recognizing warning signs in their children, about not making excuses for manipulative behavior, about the importance of intervention before it's too late. We raised money through speaking engagements and donations, partnered with the FBI to create educational materials, worked with legislators to push for stronger penalties for romance fraud, and better victim support services. The work was hard. Some days I came home exhausted from hearing story after story of women and men, because it happens to them too, who'd been destroyed by people they loved. Some days I wondered if we were making any real difference at all. But then I'd get an email from someone who'd recognized red flags in their relationship because of our materials and gotten out before losing everything. Or I'd hear from a prosecutor who'd used our resources to build a case against a predator. Or I'd see legislation pass in another state that made it easier to charge romance scammers. And I'd remember why I'd chosen to expose Ryan publicly instead of quietly, because silence protects predators. Shame protects predators. The idea that victims should hide what happened to them protects predators. Speaking up, even when it's messy and public and uncomfortable, is what protects future victims. My career survived, surprisingly. My CEO called me into her office the week after the wedding. That wasn't, and I genuinely didn't know if I was about to be fired for creating a PR nightmare. Instead, she told me she'd been in an abusive relationship 20 years ago, that she'd never told anyone at work, had been terrified it would make her seem weak or damage her professional reputation, that watching me stand up in front of 200 people and expose what had been done to me was one of the bravest things she'd ever seen. She gave me a promotion, made me senior vice president, and put me in charge of a new initiative, using our agency's resources to create public awareness campaigns about financial fraud and intimate partner manipulation. Turns out that standing up for yourself doesn't make you look weak. It makes you look strong. As for the personal stuff, the dating, the trust, the ability to open my heart again, that's been harder. I went to therapy. A lot of therapy. Worked through the anger and the humiliation and the complicated grief of mourning a relationship that was never real in the first place. My therapist helped me understand that what happened wasn't my fault, that smart people fall for cons all the time because cons are designed to exploit trust, not stupid. It took me a long time to believe that. I'm dating again now, slowly, carefully, with much better boundaries than I had before. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to trust someone the way I trusted Ryan. That naive, complete faith that someone is exactly who they say they are. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Maybe a little healthy skepticism is what keeps us safe. And I'm okay being single, actually more than. I've discovered that I like my life without someone else's agenda attached to it. I like making decisions based only on what I want, not what someone else is. The Jimmy Choo shoes, the ones I was holding when Natalie first told me the truth, I did give to her, just like I'd planned. She wore them to a friend's wedding last month and sent me a photo. She looked happy, really happy. Not the broken version of herself I'd met in that boutique. She's dating someone new too. A teacher she met through a friend, someone with a stable job and a verifiable past, and no interest in her money because he makes his own and is perfectly content with that. We all deserve that kind of simple, honest, the kind that doesn't require detective work to verify. Sometimes I think about Ryan and wonder if he's learned if he feels any remorse, if he understands the magnitude of what he did to 9 women's lives. Probably not. People like him don't tend to develop empathy in cell blocks. But I don't think about him often anymore. He doesn't deserve that space in my head. Think instead about the women who reached out to me. The ones who got out of bad relationships because of our foundation's work. The ones who reported their abusers and saw them prosecuted. The ones who rebuilt their lives after thinking everything was destroyed. I think about Natalie telling that seeing my story, about Jessica saying that speaking at our events helped her heal, about Claire getting her credit score back up and buying a new house, this time with only her name on. That's what matters. Not revenge, not even justice really, but the work that comes after building, healing, the choice to not let what happened define us forever. Last week, I was asked to give a keynote speech at a conference about financial crimes. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, I felt something I never expected to feel after everything that happened. I felt grateful, not for what Ryan did to me. I'll never be grateful for that. But for what I discovered I was capable of when pushed to my limits, for the strength I didn't know I had, for the community of survivors who turned their pain into purpose, for for the opportunity to help others avoid what I went through. Ryan thought he was taking something, thought he was the one in control, the one writing the story. But in the end, I'm the one who got to decide how this story ends. And I chose to end it with me standing in front of that still in my wedding dress, with me walking away free while he was led away in handcuffs, with me building something meaningful from the wreckage of what he tried to destroy. I chose to end it with not because I exposed him, not because I refused to let what he did to me. The most important thing about my life is what came. The work, healing, the other women I've been able to help, the person I've become because I chose to fight instead. That's my story. Not the story of the woman who almost married a con artist. The story of the woman who exposed him, survived him, and built something better from the ruins. And if you're reading this, if you're watching this because you've been through something similar, because someone you trusted, because you're trying to figure out how to rebuild after your world fell apart, I want you to know something. You're not alone. You're not stupid. You're not to blame for someone else's cruelty. You're stronger than you think. I know, because I've been where you are, and I made it through to the other side. You will too.